Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? It's strange, isn't it, how some stories find the right people at the right time. Maybe this one found you for a reason. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the shadows take over. Story 1, The Stalking Neighbor and the Knocks. The summer I moved into that little rental in Dayton, Ohio, 2018. I was drowning in peace. I'd traded paper-thin apartment walls and all-night parties for silence. Sweet, heavy, beautiful silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of the interstate and the relentless buzz of the cicadas in the trees. For the first week, I thought I'd won the lottery. Then I met Greg. It was late one sticky July night. I'd just hauled the last box of books from the trunk when I noticed the movement next door. He was tall, rail-thin, maybe late 40s. He wasn't walking, wasn't smoking, wasn't doing a damn thing. He was just standing there, inside the shadow line of his yard, facing my house. It was suffocatingly hot, but he wore a gray hoodie, the hood pulled up, erasing his face. I tried to be friendly, lifting my hand in a casual wave. He didn't wave back. He just smiled. It wasn't a smile a human makes. It was too wide, too stiff, a practiced grimace, like he was trying to mimic something he'd only seen in a picture. A jolt of pure, cold unease hit me, despite the summer heat. Over the next few days, the peace was poisoned. I'd leave for work in the morning, and he'd be on his porch. I'd come home, and he'd be pacing his driveway, hands shoved deep in that hoodie. Later, I'd peek through the blinds, and he'd be there, motionless, staring straight at my house. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight on my skin. Then, the build began. The silence broke. It was just after 2:00 in the morning when I woke. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, patient. 3 distinct taps on the front door. I froze in the dark, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I thought he must hear it through the wood. I waited, terrified, until the house settled back into an agonizing silence. The next night, the same thing. 3 slow knocks. I crept to the living room window, pulled the blind back a fraction, and my blood ran cold. Greg was standing halfway between his house and mine, staring directly at my door, waiting, not moving, not speaking, waiting for me to open it. The police came. Greg told them he was just checking on me. That phrase, checking on me, sank into my mind like a splinter. The officer left, telling me to lock my doors. But the worst was the escalation. A few nights later, I was brushing my teeth upstairs. I heard a scraping sound outside my bedroom window. My stomach dropped. I flipped off the light, crept forward, and peeled back the blinds. His face was there, inches away, grinning through the glass. He was on a ladder at 200 on the 2nd floor. I scrambled backward, fumbling for my phone. By the time 911 picked up, he was gone, but the ladder remained, leaning against the side of my house. The panic never truly left after that. I taped my curtains shut. I slept with a baseball bat. He changed tactics. A Polaroid photo of my bedroom window, taken from his yard, was tucked under my doormat. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps in my fenced-in backyard, leaving muddy prints by the fence. I lived in a state of suspended terror, jumping at every creak, every shadow. Then came the night of the climax. It was 3 hazards in the morning. I didn't hear a knock or a scrape. I heard the unmistakable sound of wood scraping wood and the chilling flap of the curtain, my back door creaking open. I grabbed the bat and crept into the kitchen, hyperventilating. The back door was wide open. I stood frozen, certain he was inside. And then I heard them. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy, coming closer. I whispered into the phone, dialing 911, my hand shaking so hard I could barely hold the device. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. The police searched everything. They found nothing inside. But when they checked his property, they reported back Greg's house was empty, completely cleared out. He had vanished overnight. I moved out a month later, but sometimes, late at night, I wake up to a sound that makes my blood run cold. 3 slow, patient knocks at the door. And I don't dare check, because deep down, I know Greg never really left. Story 2, The Crawlspace Landlord. Moving into that basement studio in Boston, I was desperate, broke, stressed by grad school, and grateful for the low rent. The place was half underground. The tiny windows barely admitted gray light, and the walls were paneled in fake, oppressive wood. The ceiling was so low you could feel the sound of Mr. Carter's footsteps, the landlord who lived upstairs, echoing right above my head. At first, Mr. Carter seemed kind, mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes. He checked on the heat, the water pressure. I thought I had lucked out. But then the subtle shifts began. I'd come home and notice my desk chair was pulled out. I always tuck it in. My toothbrush was damp, though I hadn't used it all day. Once, the fridge door was left a crack open, and a carton of eggs was gone. I told myself it was stress, forgetfulness. But the fear became undeniable. My phone would be on the kitchen counter instead of my nightstand. My bed sheets were pulled taut, tucked in at the corners, in a way I never did. One afternoon, I swore I heard footsteps slow, deliberate, inside my empty apartment as I unlocked the door. When I asked Mr. Carter if he had a spare key, he smiled too quickly and said he only used it for emergencies. That night, I fastened the chain lock inside, the only barrier he couldn't bypass, or so I thought. Around 2 Hezro A, I woke up to a faint, nauseating sound. It wasn't upstairs. It was coming from the ceiling, a gentle, unsettling scraping, the sound of wood shifting, nails creaking, like something heavy was crawling directly above me. I held my breath, staring up at the flimsy paneling, overwhelmed by the crushing sense of claustrophobia in that tiny room. The next morning, I shone a flashlight into one of the ceiling vents. My stomach twisted. The metal grate was scratched, bent slightly. Deep inside the duct, I caught a glint of reflection, like a lens, like glass. I bought a cheap, motion-activated camera and pointed it at my bed. On the 4th night, I finally had proof. The 3:19 a.m. footage was a cold punch to the gut. Mr. Carter slipped in, silent. He browsed my phone, drank half my soda, and then walked to my bed. For 10 agonizing minutes, he just stood there, watching me sleep. His hand hovered inches from my face. Then he leaned down, his glasses gleaming in the night vision, and whispered something the camera didn't catch. I was shaking violently when I took the footage to the police, but they called it not clear enough to prove anything. I felt utterly violated and alone. That night, I kept every light on. The chain lock was secured. Then, at 2 a.m., the scraping returned. I dragged a chair over, yanked open the vent, and shined the light inside. It wasn't just a vent. It was a crawl space above the basement ceiling. And inside, pushed just out of reach, were a blanket, a water bottle, and a pile of wrappers. Someone had been living there. Before I could scream, I heard a distinct shift of weight. The sound of Wade breathing. My light caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the dark, staring back at me. I fell off the chair and ran. I ran until I was pounding on a neighbor's door 2 houses down. By the time the police came, the crawl space was empty. Mr. Carter denied everything. They had no evidence. I left the next day, abandoning half my possessions because I couldn't bear to touch anything in that basement again. It's been years, but even now, in the deepest part of the night, I sometimes wake up, certain I can hear someone breathing just out of sight. The fear is no longer loud and panicked. It is quiet, persistent, and waiting. Story 3, The Girl in the Window. I rented a house in Chandler, Arizona, looking for quiet. I found a modest stucco home on a block of beige predictability tidy lawns, desert landscaping, retired couples waving. It felt safe, normal, except for the house directly across the street. The blinds in the upstairs window were always drawn tight, but every night, without fail, a single lamp glowed up there. I met the owner, David, a polite man with a distracted air, who lived alone with his teenage daughter, Lily. I saw her once or twice quiet, pale, head always down. For weeks, things were routine. David worked. I'd sometimes glance across and see Lily at her desk, head bent over homework, normal stuff. Then came the night the air finally cooled in late October. I was scrolling on my phone around 2:45 a.m. when I glanced out. She was there. Lily was standing perfectly still in the upstairs window, not at her desk, not moving. She was facing my house, her face half lit by the lamp's cold glow. She didn't move. Not a flicker. Not even a blink. I told myself she was a typical odd teenager, maybe couldn't sleep. But the next night, she was there again. The same window, the same position, perfectly still, staring at my house. I froze in my kitchen, water glass halfway to my lips. My skin crawled. Over the next week, it became a ritual, a pattern I couldn't unsee. Every night, exactly at 2:45 a.m., she appeared, motionless, her eyes locked on my house. I finally tried to ask David. He was washing his car, the sunlight warm and harmless. The sponge slipped from his hand, splashing water on his jeans. For a split second, his face twisted in raw fear. "She's fine," he clipped, forcing a smile. He leaned in, his voice urgent. "Just don't pay attention to that. And if I were you, I wouldn't look at that window again." That night, curiosity was a relentless itch. I crept to the window at 2:40 a.m., lifted the blind just enough to peek. She was there, perfectly still. But this time, she wasn't alone. My stomach dropped. Standing right beside her was another figure, identical. Same dark hair, same pale face, same clothes. 2 lilies, both staring directly at my house. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. I told myself it was tiredness, a trick of the light, anything but the truth. 2 nights later, I looked again. Only one lily, but she wasn't standing deep in the room anymore. She was closer, pressed right up against the glass. her face inches from the pane, even from across the street. In the dim light, I could see her lips moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. The fear reached a shattering point the following night. I came home to find a note slipped under my door. No envelope, no signature. Don't watch the window. I obeyed, shuttering my blinds tight, but at 3 a.m., I cracked them, just a fraction. The upstairs window across the street was dark. No lamp, no Lily, empty. Relief washed over me until I heard the sound of faint tapping from my own window. I turned slowly, and there she was. Lily's pale face pressed against the glass from the outside. I live on a single story. There is no ledge, no balcony, only a sheer wall beneath that window. I screamed. 2 days later, police cars lined the street. A detective came to my porch. I told him about the lights, about the girl in the window. He exchanged a look with his partner, then faced me. "Sir," he said gently, "David's daughter died in a car accident 8 months ago. There is no one else in that house." That night, at 2:45 a.m., I couldn't resist. I looked one last time. The lamp was on, and in the upstairs window, Lily stood perfectly still, staring straight at me. Story 4, The Chains and Polaroids. I rented a townhouse in Denver, craving the quiet that only rows of identical, connected units can offer. My next-door neighbor was Mrs. Holloway, late 60s, neatly curled white hair, and big sliding glasses. She trimmed roses, offered polite waves, and seemed like the kind of woman who baked cookies for church. The sheer normalcy of her presence was the first layer of dread. It started subtly. After midnight, my bedroom wall was shared with her unit, and I began hearing sounds. At first, I dismissed them old pipes, low TV volume, but the more I listened, the more distinct they became. Muffled voices, sometimes rising like an argument, sometimes punctuated by a soft, desperate sobbing. It wasn't one voice, it was several, low, overlapping, almost like prayers. The sounds felt private, something I wasn't meant to interrupt, so I tried to forget them. Then, the packages began arriving. Big, heavy cardboard boxes, delivered silently after midnight. I never saw the truck. When I passed them on my way to the trash, the labels listed things that didn't fit the image of a sweet older woman. Padlocks, chains, heavy-duty bolts, soundproofing foam, and industrial cleaner. I tried to bring it up casually at the mailboxes. I asked if she was renovating. Her smile froze. Her eyes, magnified behind the glass, were hard and unblinking. "Some things," she said, her voice dropping, "are best not noticed." And she turned away. That night, the voices were louder than ever. I pressed my ear against the drywall. The sound was unmistakable. Sobbing. Multiple people. I could feel the faint vibration of fists hitting the wall. I wanted to call the police, but fear and the certainty that I would sound like a lunatic stopped me. The next morning, while Mrs. Holloway was out, I crept into the alley behind the complex. Through a narrow gap in her downstairs curtains, I caught a glimpse, just for a second. Chains. Thick chains bolted to the floor. 2 nights later, the crying didn't just return, it turned into screaming. High-pitched, raw, and terrified. I didn't hesitate. I called 911. I watched from my porch as officers forced their way inside. I'll never forget the pale, shaken face of the officer who came back out. He told me they'd found a locked room at the back of the house, padlocked from the outside. It was empty. No people, no bodies. Just 4 walls covered in deep scratches. The chains bolted to the floor, and dozens of Polaroid photos taped up. Photos of me sleeping in my bed, me at my desk, me cooking in my kitchen. The police confiscated the photos but couldn't charge her with anything. There was no victim, no crime. Now, Mrs. Holloway was gone by the next morning. Vanished. I tried to convince myself it was over, but a few weeks later, the silence broke again. The sounds returned, not from her townhouse, but from mine. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, muffled crying, faint pounding, coming from inside my own walls. And that's when I realized she hadn't left at all. Story 5, The Man in Apartment 12. The first thing I noticed about the man in apartment 12 wasn't him, but the object he carried. I was struggling up the stairwell, my arms numb from bags of groceries, when I saw him dragging something across the landing. It was tall, narrow, and wrapped tightly in a yellowing sheet and old twine. For a split second, my exhausted mind registered the shape as a coffin. The thing scraped against the wall, a shriek of wood and concrete that hurt my teeth as he struggled to wedge it through his doorway. Out of instinct, I offered to help. He froze, his head turned slowly, unnervingly slow, towards me. His eyes were wide, dark, and utterly flat, reflecting the bare landing bulb like 2 black pools. He didn't speak. He just looked at me until the skin on my neck prickled. Then he wordlessly pulled the object inside and slammed the door shut. I knew then that whatever was wrapped in that sheet wasn't meant to be seen. The atmosphere in the building changed. Every time I walked past his apartment, I felt a heavy, cold weight. The light under his door was always on, and a strange, faint smell like ozone and old dust leaked from the cracks. Then, I started seeing the reflections. Our apartments faced each other across the narrow hallway, separated by a single, peeling paint wall. Sometimes, when his door was ajar, I would catch a glimpse inside. The place was lined with mirrors, not decorative ones, but large, industrial sheets of glass, leaning against the walls, tilted at unnatural angles. They doubled, tripled, and infinitely tall repeated, the tiny space in a claustrophobic maze. It felt less like an apartment and more like a mirror room. One evening, I saw him standing in his doorway. He was just looking into the hall, and in the background, a cascade of reflections followed him, multiplying his silhouette into an army of quiet observers. It was dizzying. I became obsessed with the mirrors. They seemed to possess a stillness that was not quite empty, a silent, breathing presence. I imagined the glass constantly watching, recording every shadow, every subtle movement in the hall. The psychological toll began to manifest in my own apartment. I would catch a distortion of my own reflection in the unpolished glass of my stove or a window pane, a shadow standing too close behind me, moving slightly out of sync. I started covering the reflective surfaces in my unit. The final descent happened during a power outage. The hallway was pitch black. I fumbled for my keys and swore I felt a draft coming from apartment 12 smelling strongly of ozone. When the power flickered back on, I was standing directly in front of his door, and in the thin, yellow light under the door, I saw it, my own reflection, but it wasn't coming from inside my mind. Inside the mirror room, The man from apartment 12 was standing by his own doorway, and reflected in the mirror directly behind him, staring out into the dark, was my face. Not his. Mine. For a chilling second, I couldn't tell who was truly standing in the hallway or who was merely the distortion, caught in the cold, repetitive glass. I didn't wait to see which face would move first. I still live in the building, but the fear of reflections is a physical pain. I see myself in the bus window, in my darkened computer screen, and I wonder, is it me looking out, or is it the man in apartment 12, finally seeing himself through my eyes? I moved into an older house nestled deep in a quiet, forested area. My only immediate neighbor was Mr. Hale, an elderly man, and his dog. The dog wasn't just large, it was gaunt. A massive, skeletal silhouette of coarse, black fur with eyes that seemed to swallow the light. It was less a companion and more a sentinel of bone and shadow. The creature I never learned its name didn't bark or run. It just stood, always in the overgrown shade of Mr. Hale's yard, always staring at my house, with a chilling, absolute stillness. I started noticing its anatomy was wrong. Its legs seemed too long, its head too small for its heavy shoulders. In the weak afternoon sun, I swore I could see the subtle protrusion of vertebrae beneath the fur, shifting in ways that felt less canine and more insectile. The quiet was now a void, filled only by the dog's watchful presence. My psychological decay began almost immediately. I found myself obsessively tracking its movements. If I moved to my kitchen window, the shadow by the fence would shift imperceptibly, its head tilting just enough to maintain eye contact. I began sleeping less, convinced the dog was the only thing preventing something else from crossing the property line. Then the boundaries blurred. One humid night, I woke up, drenched in sweat. I had been dreaming of the dog, but in the dream, its skin was pulled back, and I saw a horrifying, repeating pattern of teeth deep within its throat, grinding in silence. When I looked out the window, the dog was gone. Relief washed over me until I looked down. Lying right on my front lawn, pressed flat against the damp grass, was a mass of black fur. Not loose hair, but a patch of thick, oily pelt, about the size of a dinner plate, as if the creature had simply shed a piece of itself. In the night, I started finding more. On my porch, near the back fence, always black fur, clumped, slightly damp, and strangely heavy. The dog itself seemed to be shrinking, its gauntness becoming more pronounced. It was as if it was slowly, deliberately. Lot bo lop da, de lai mothuzi da nguyen thui hun benjui. One morning, the dog was gone entirely. Mr. Hale waved casually, saying the dog had simply moved on. But I knew that wasn't the end. The silence now felt like a held breath. That night, I woke up to a sound that wasn't outside, but inside my house. It was a faint, shallow breathing, close to the floor. I held my own breath, listening to the agonizingly slow inhale and exhale. I didn't dare turn on the light. I just stared into the oppressive dark. In the morning, the sound was gone, but when I went to the kitchen, I found it a single, large, muddy paw print near the back door. It wasn't the print of a domestic dog. The toes were too long, the sole too wide, and the imprint was unnervingly shallow. I knew the dog hadn't moved on. It had just figured out how to get closer. It was slowly disassembling itself to become a constant, unseen presence, a breathing shadow in the house that was once my refuge. Story 7, The Man Below, Unit 8, Chicago. I took a small, cheap apartment in a crumbling building in Chicago. My unit was on the second floor. The man directly below me, in Unit 8, was never seen, only heard. His presence was a constant, low-grade thrumming that poisoned the silence. It began with the noise, a constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel through the concrete and into my bones. It wasn't music, wasn't TV. It sounded like machinery running at the absolute edge of audibility, or perhaps a massive, hidden heart beating beneath the foundation. Then came the smell. A noxious, metallic odor that seeped up through the floorboards, sometimes sharp like old copper, sometimes thick with something vaguely sulfurous and synthetic. It clung to my curtains, my clothes, my skin. I complained, but the landlord claimed to find nothing. The sounds escalated into auditory torture. I started hearing whispers, low, overlapping voices, always just below the threshold of comprehension. They came from the floor, swirling up into my room, too dense to parse, yet too insistent to ignore. I would wake at 3 a.m., staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, feeling the voices vibrate in my own teeth. The most terrifying sound was the scuttling, a fast, dry, chitinous noise like hundreds of insects skittering across the floor in Unit 8 only to stop the instant my own foot touched the ground. The sound drove a wedge into my sanity. I began to experience a profound mental schism. Inside my head, 2 voices started to argue. One was my own, desperately rationalizing the noise as pipes, as old wiring. The other voice was cold, deep, and utterly alien, suggesting the noise wasn't machinery, but a process, something being perpetually ground down or repeated down below, a ritual that couldn't be stopped. I became convinced that the man in Unit 8 was not just making noise. He was actively channeling something vast and terrible, using the floor as a conduit. I started to see the world as a thin veneer stretched over an ancient, chthonic truth that Unit 8 was exposing. Driven by the alien voice, I finally tried to intervene. I pounded on his door. Silence. When I pressed my ear to the wood, I didn't hear the hum or the whispers. I heard a deep, wet, gurgling inhale. So loud it sounded like it came from a creature the size of the building. I backed away, terrified. When the police finally came after weeks of my frantic calls, they entered the unit. It was empty. No furniture, no bed, just 4 bare concrete walls covered in hundreds of tiny, interlocking symbols, drawn in dried, black liquid. There was a single rusted basin in the center of the floor, still smelling strongly of sulfur. The man was gone, having vanished without a trace. I moved out the next day, desperate to escape the vibrations, but the move changed nothing. Now, years later, I live in a quiet, isolated cabin, but in the deep silence of the woods, I still hear the vibration. It's no longer external. It is the low, constant thrumming in my skull, the relentless hum of the other voice, whispering the truth of the void. And I know the man below didn't leave the building. He simply came up. Story 8, The Door to the Impossible. I bought the old house in rural Pennsylvania for its isolation. My nearest neighbor was an elderly, secluded man named Mr. Kessler. The house itself was vast, quiet, and old, so old that its secrets felt baked into the wood and stone. The terror began not with a knock or a stare, but with a structural anomaly, a door in the basement that shouldn't have been there. It was built flush into the foundation, made of thick, pitted steel with an antique latch, and it was always cold to the touch. The previous owners had simply walled it off with plywood and drywall. The minute I tore down the flimsy barrier, the atmosphere shifted. The basement air, usually dry, turned damp and heavy, carrying a strange, tempting smell of sulfur and old metal. When I put my ear to the cold steel, I could hear a sound that filled the impossibly deep space beyond. Whispers. Not arguing like the man below in Chicago, but lulling, seductive whispers that promised knowledge and release. I started seeing Mr. Kessler. He would stand at the edge of his property, gazing at my basement. He never crossed the line, but one afternoon, he left a note on my porch. "Leave the steel alone. It's what keeps them out." His warning only amplified my obsession. The whispers became personalized. They knew my fears, my regrets. They promised to resolve the tension of my life. I spent sleepless nights downstairs, listening to the siren song of the voices, feeling the cold steel radiating a power that made the air throb. The basement, though small, began to feel infinite, a dizzying, terrifying void extending down into the earth. Finally, driven by a despair only the whispers could soothe, I broke the final barrier. I forced the antique latch. The door swung inward with a heavy, grinding sound of metal on stone. The sight that greeted me was not a room, but a terrifying, hellish reveal. It was an impossible space, a huge, cavernous drop lit by a low, red light, filled with vast, echoing structures and the sight of impossible geometry. And the whispers were no longer a sound. They were a physical force, rushing out and filling the basement, trying to enter me. I slammed the door shut, locking the latch. The silence in the basement was now thick, ringing, and absolute. I boarded up the door, then walled it off with concrete and steel, terrified that the simple act of looking had irrevocably changed me. I never saw Mr. Kessler again. I moved out of the house a month later, fleeing the memory of that infinite space. I found a new, quiet, modern condo, sterile and safe. I thought I had escaped the cycle. But late last night, I went into my new, pristine kitchen to get a glass of water, and there, built flush into the wall behind my refrigerator, cold to the touch, was a door. Small, steel, with a pitted antique latch. And when I pressed my ear to it, I could hear them, the whispers. They had followed me. The cycle wasn't broken. The door to the impossible had simply found a new basement inside my life.